next half hour, we will control what you see and hear. You are about to experience the terror and foul horror of the Simpsons Halloween Special.
So yeah, if you remember my Lisa on Ice video when I said there are only 2 more Season 6 episodes that I would give a 10 out of 10, I'm just gonna get this out of the way here. Treehouse of Horror 5 is a 10 out of 10 episode. Hell, if it wasn't a sin against nature, I'd rate it an 11 out of 10. It is bar none the best Simpsons Treehouse of Horror episode of all time. Normally I would rate all the segments at the end, but like, the Shinning is a 10 out of 10, Time and Punishment is a 10 out of 10, and Nightmare Cafeteria is a 10 out of 10. In previous Halloween episodes that I've done, I mentioned that there's a discussion for what the second best Treehouse of Horror usually is, and that discussion bounces between 3 and 4 with the occasional hat drop for 7. But the Simpsons fanbase tends to unanimously agree that Treehouse of Horror 5 is the undisputed best Treehouse of Horror episode ever made. But why is it immediately a 10 out of 10? What does Treehouse of Horror 5 do that is so special? Well, we can see that as early as the intro to the episode. I mentioned in my Bar of Darkness review that it felt like a farewell to the first 5 seasons of The Simpsons. Well, Treehouse of Horror 5 felt like a send-off to the original format of the Treehouse of Horror episodes, where it was a lot of emphasis on staging, such as, the intros, or Marge and Homer doing the word of warning thing with the graveyard opening and the wraparound segment. Much of the presentation that they had going on for these first 5 Simpsons Halloween specials would be gone by the end of Treehouse of Horror 5. For example, this would be the last time the red curtain homage to Frankenstein's word of warning would be featured until much later in the Treehouse of Horror 28 segment, Homer. Unlike Treehouse of Horror 1 and 2, Treehouse of Horror 5 did a whole set of new animation and frames for this word of warning segment, with Marge decreeing that this episode has been deemed so scary that they'll be showing some Old West movie instead, which is then cut off by an excellent parody of The Outer Limits with Bart. And when that's done, we break into the final ever original Treehouse of Horror graveyard intro, and I gotta say, they go balls to the walls with this opening. Despite there being only one tombstone gag within this opening, it's a tombstone gag that signals that they're done doing the tombstone gags. But instead of a bunch of tombstone gags, we get characters dying left and right. The music is just going as hard as it's ever gone, and I actually want to bring something up about the couch gag because it's kind of driven me nuts for a while. Now, we all know about alterations that were made to the show in repeat airings, especially on network channels. Some of these cuts were made to fit in more commercials, which involved episodes having whole gags cut out. This one, they did cut quite a bit when it came to reruns, but one thing I remember them altering was the couch gag. I can't find any evidence of this, so I might just be misremembering or sounding crazy, but the dismembered family couch gag in the original airing has the family hop onto frame and swap body parts. But I swear, in some repeat airings, I saw a version where they don't hop on, they break out of the floor, much like the zombie gag from the previous Halloween special. Now, what's playing tricks on me here is, I'm trying to remember, did they, because I know they would swap out couch gags sometimes on repeat airings. I don't know if they just put the zombie family gag from the previous special in place of the dismembered family gag. I don't know if it's my brain playing tricks on me, or if they actually animated a different couch gag, a different version of the dismembered family couch gag where they came out the floor. This whole thing's been driving me fucking nuts for years, so if anybody knows anything about this, please let me know in the comments. One alteration I definitely remember because I saw it in some earlier downloadable versions of this episode from the LimeWire days involved them cutting out the whole Outer Limits parody. It's safe to say with this intro, right off the bat, we get a dose of horror and violence that, honestly, when I was a kid, kind of shocked me when I first saw this episode. This episode, in its intro and in the episode itself, really pushed the limits of what they could get away with on primetime network television. Now, the reason this episode pushes it so hard is because the at-the-time showrunner David Merkin believed that while the Treehouse of Horror episodes should be funny, they should also push the limits of horror and violence as much as humanly possible. And with that, we have what is probably the most horrific and violent Treehouse of Horror episode of the first 8 seasons of the show.
Oh my. It seems the show is so scary that Congress won't even let us show it. Instead, they've suggested the 1947 classic Glenn Ford movie, 200 Miles to Oregon.
The whole thing with Marge saying how Congress won't let them show the episode was actually a reference to the fact that, at the time, Congress was pushing for more censorship on The Simpsons due to the amount of violence. And as a result, David Merkin attempted to, quote, put as much blood and guts into this show as he could. More recent Treehouse of Horror episodes have gone for more violence and shock value, but unlike those, the violence in this episode isn't really solely for shock value. There's some shock value attached to it, but there is a point to it. In essence, yes, when a show like The Simpsons uses violence, it is meant to garner a shock reaction, but it really doesn't do that like in a tasteless manner for this episode. It all makes perfect sense, and it all works to the highest level. So after the intro, we finally get to our first story, and this segment is one of the segments that often tops list ranking every single Treehouse of Horror segment. In my older, out-of-date top 10 Treehouse of Horror segments video, I ranked it at number 1, and yeah, in terms of structure and what it does, this is probably the best Treehouse of Horror segment of all time. The Shinning, if you didn't figure it out by now, is a parody of The Shining. Not so much the Stephen King novel, but Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of it. Stanley Kubrick was admittedly a huge fan of The Simpsons, and David Merkin, the showrunner, as well as the writers, were all huge Kubrick nuts. I'm guessing they saw a lot of Kubrick's work during their formative years, because you can really see the influence that Kubrick had on the series. In the early run of The Simpsons, there was at least one Kubrick reference per season. They had done countless Kubrick references throughout the entire, at the time, 5 to 6 series run, including several references to The Shining. So naturally, upon learning that Kubrick was a fan of the series, they set out to do a parody of one of his movies within the confines of a Halloween episode. And yeah, you can just tell this whole parody was made with love and care, because it has homages to the movie that run so deep. Despite being short, it actually does a very effective job of telling the story of Stanley Kubrick's The Shining.
That's odd. Usually the blood gets off at the second floor.
Basically, like, every character that they cast works perfectly. Homer as Jack, Bart as Danny, Marge as Wendy, and Willie as Dick Halloran. With Lisa and Maggie being there just to fill the dynamic of it being a Simpsons story.
There's plenty I can do to keep myself occupied. Maybe I'll check out that axe collection. See you later.
Mom, is Dad gonna kill us?
We're just gonna have to wait and see.
Right from the get-go, they managed to waste a little bit of time with a repeated gag of Homer forgetting something while they're driving out there, but it is a repetitive gag that worked.
Well, it's been 2 long trips, but we're finally almost there again.
When you locked the front door, did you remember to lock the back door?
Don't!
I understand why they did a repeat gag here. And I just love how Homer is so pissed after having to go back twice that he just says fuck it and leaves Grandpa at the gas station.
Oh no! We left Grandpa back at the gas station! What about Grandpa?
And the episode itself pokes fun at some of the narrative issues with The Shining. Like, yeah, I don't know, like, something about The Shining, like, if they kind of were used to murders happening at the Overlook, you'd think they'd change how they did the off-season work thing. Like, yeah, I get it, there are supernatural forces at work in The Shining, but, like, still, you know, every murder that happens there seems to be the same situation, where it's like the winter caretaker team, the guy butchering his family, it's like, yeah, just get, like, some homeless people to do it or something. I gotta say, though, there's a little bit of a negative drawback to this parody, as it chooses to go straight for the Wendy-Jack dynamic with Homer and Marge, and it doesn't really play into the psychic power aspects through the Bart as Danny character. It downplays the role of Bart and his siblings significantly. Granted, this episode had a lot of stuff cut out, but yeah, you almost forget that they established Bart has the Shinning.
You mean shining?
Shh! You wanna get sued?
Because it's utilized so sparingly, whereas it was a pretty major part of the film and the book. But honestly, that's fine, because the stuff with Homer and Marge is fucking brilliant.
Give me the bat! Come on! Give me the bat! Give me the bat! Scaredy cat! Yeah.
I absolutely love how straight and to the point they are with The Shinning. They get all the plot beats of The Shining and kind of just get to Homer going crazy as fast as possible.
Don't mind if I do! What?
Like, they just kind of just don't even beat around the bushes here. You have Moe showing up and telling Homer to kill his family. The Shinning captures the horror aspect of the source material, but it breaks the tension all the time by being absolutely hilarious. The idea of Homer going crazy and attempting to murder his family is an idea of horror, but him scaring himself in the mirror and falling down the stairs is fucking hilarious. Even just before that, when he bursts in on Marge and he says hello and his lips don't move, it immediately breaks the jump scare because it looks and sounds so funny.
Hello!
This is actually pretty funny. The part where Moe and the ghouls pull Homer out of the freezer and it's like all these different horror characters. Looking back, I'm like 90% sure that this was my first introduction to characters such as Freddy, Jason, and Pinhead. I think the most immediately recognizable scene from The Shining is the scene of Jack knocking down the bathroom door.
Here's Johnny!
Like, even people who have never seen The Shining in full know of that scene. And this being The Simpsons, they were gonna do something good with this. Cue Homer getting the wrong room several times.
Here's Johnny! David Letterman!
Hi, David. I'm Grandpa.
Go!
When he does the 60 minutes thing, like, I don't know how many takes it took Dan Castellaneta to do this, but it's really funny sounding, and like, he has like the stopwatch and everything. This is great. This being a Treehouse of Horror episode, it's like they're doing this as fast as possible because they gotta fit in 2 more segments, but it doesn't take away from this segment at all. The Crash TV style meshes well with what they were trying to accomplish, and what they were trying to accomplish was a pretty tall order. Basically, they had to summarize the entire movie of The Shining within a 7-minute time frame. And I must say, they did a pretty good job of doing that. They got all the signature scenes in there, they told the story from A to B. They basically were able to condense a 2-hour and 20-minute movie into a 7-minute segment, and that's high efficiency if I've ever heard of it. The constricting time frame of a Treehouse of Horror segment does no damage to this segment at all. In fact, one could say that it greatly benefits from the constricting time limit because it forces them to do a Crash TV type thing where they just kind of throw every reference and moment at you in quick succession. So what's interesting about Treehouse of Horror 5 is they actually do something that wasn't done before this episode, and I don't think has been done since. They use Willie as the Dick Halloran character from The Shining, you know, the kindly groundskeeper who gets killed by Jack near the climax of the film. The one who knows about Danny's shinning.
You mean shining?
Shh! You wanna get sued?
But in a weird twist, he actually manages to appear in the next 2 segments where he suffers the same fate. In essence, Treehouse of Horror 5 is probably the closest Groundskeeper Willie ever got to having a spotlight episode. Sure, he doesn't get much character development here, but he's treated as an important supporting character, probably for the first time in the entire series, and this doesn't happen for him very often. Although I like in his earlier conversation with Bart when he tells him not to read his mind between 4 and 5, because that's Willie's time, with the implication that Willie is just like pounding it during those hours.
Uh-oh! The little fat boy and his family are in trouble! I'm coming to rescue the lot of you!
Of course, they got 2 more segments to get to, so they really kind of just wrap this up quickly by having the whole family freeze to death like Jack at the end of the movie. Of course, they're not actually dead. They're still alive, and they're bickering because something crappy came on the TV. There isn't a lot I can really say about The Shinning that hasn't already been said. It's truly a great one. It's the greatest one. It's fast-paced, it's funny, and it actively satirizes the material it's parodying without being disrespectful. Kubrick loved it, everyone loved it. If I had to nitpick one more issue, though, I think it's the overuse of the repeated or drawn out gags. It's a minor issue because, yeah, these gags were funny, but it felt like them dwelling on certain gags took a little bit away from the rest of the plot of this segment. Like I said, this episode and this segment in particular had quite a bit trimmed out of it, and maybe they could have shortened up some of the gags in order to kind of let that stuff into the episode, but nevertheless, it doesn't really affect the episode enough to damage my perception of it. The Shinning is bar none the best single segment of Treehouse of Horror ever made, and it just serves as a reminder that at one point these episodes were Halloween themed and actively tried to make an affectionate parody of horror media. I think the funniest thing about The Shinning is this is where I first heard about the movie The The Shining. A lot of the horror stuff that I like today, there's a good chance that if it was parodied on The Simpsons, that's probably where I first was exposed to it. I have this distinct memory of just sitting in my dad's room watching TV with him, and he's flipping channels, and The Shining was airing on like Showcase or Bravo or something. It had just started, and my dad was like, oh, that's that movie that The Simpsons made fun of. You want to watch it? And I was like, okay. That's like the first horror movie I ever watched. Not counting like sci-fi horror, but that's different. I know quite a few people who are like, yeah, The Shining was like my first horror movie that I ever watched, because yeah, that thing aired on TV in the 90s a lot. And I'm willing to bet most kids just sat down and watched it because they recognized that The Simpsons had parodied it before. Looking back, it's probably not the most appropriate movie for an 8 or 9-year-old to watch, but then again, my dad also let me watch Silence of the Lambs when I was that age, and when I asked him, why did you let me watch that when I was like 8 years old, he said, because it's a damn good movie. I know most people around my age are starting to have kids of their own, not me, because I'm a fuck up, but don't censor what your kids watch. Let your kid watch The fucking Shining and Silence of the Lambs, because I watched them and I turned out okay. No, I didn't. Now, as I mentioned, Treehouse of Horror 5 does not have wraparound segments. They got rid of that, it's done. So it just goes for all of its segments one after the other. It's weird how over the years they shut off certain aspects of these specials to make them easier to make and give them more time for the segments. What with them getting rid of the wraparound segments in the previous special and them getting rid of the graveyard intro and tombstone gags in this special, they did all these little things where they'd take stuff away to kind of optimize how they made these episodes. And it didn't just stop at that. Like, throughout the years, the intros would become much shorter before becoming inexplicably longer, to the point where in some Halloween specials it seems like the intros are segments in and of themselves. They even tried to get rid of something as simple as the spooky names in the credits, but that was brought back pretty quickly due to fan outrage. But it gets me thinking, like, all the stuff that they took away from these specials made them seem less special. I do agree that them leaving out wraparounds in Treehouse of Horror 5 was to the benefit of the episode, because these segments all have a lot of meat that they needed to get on the table. And yeah, the wraparounds would have been way too cumbersome. But looking at how much they got rid of for this special has me really thinking about how they got way too comfortable just shedding stuff off from these specials. It kind of just set them on a path where they were like, okay, we're gonna do it like this from now on, and then they just kept removing things and removing things. It got to the point where something as simple as a fucking Halloween-themed couch gag was more of a maybe than a guarantee. Which, like, you know, The Simpsons, what's run for like almost 1,000 episodes at this point, like I think 99% of the episodes have had a couch gag, and the only reason it's probably not 100% is because they just stopped doing them for some Halloween episodes. Anyway, I'm done going back to the intro, going back to what they got rid of after this episode. Now I'm just gonna straight up talk about the next two segments, and the next segment is Time and Punishment, which is pretty much a parody of several different science fiction stories, including The Time Machine. The premise is simple. Homer breaks the toaster because his hand got stuck in it.
Dad! Your hand is jammed in the toaster!
And then while repairing it, he accidentally turns it into a time machine somehow. This uses another drawn-out gag to bring us into it, but I think this one does it a little better because this toaster bit is really fucking hilarious. This is like one of the very few Simpsons sequences that, despite having seen it like hundreds of times, it can still get me to the point where I'm fucking laughing so hard that I can't breathe. It's gotten funnier like the more I've seen it, because now I imagine like they're writing it up and they're like, oh, Homer turns the toaster into a time machine, and they're like, okay, how does he do that? And somebody's like, well, he breaks it and has to repair it and accidentally turns it into a time machine. They're like, how does he break it? And then they came up with this whole fucking hand in the toaster sequence. Like, Dan Castellaneta went fucking hardcore in this with the screaming and the yelling, and it's just absolutely fucking brilliant. It starts out with a really funny part, but I think it kind of slows itself down, and as a result, I'm sorry to say that Time and Punishment is easily the weakest portion of this Halloween special. This is still a 10 out of 10, but it's definitely a lower 10 out of 10, and if I wanted to be a dick, I could rank it lower, but I'm gonna go ahead and say that Time and Punishment is more so a 10 out of 10 by association. Homer constantly ruining the timeline is really funny, and the sci-fi references are great. Where else can you get a reference to 1984 and Mr. Peabody that land perfectly?
That's right, Mr. Peabody.
Quiet, you.
But the main issue with Time and Punishment is it just screams middle cooldown segment. The Shinning went super hard. It did a really good parody of a really good Kubrick movie. Time and Punishment is definitely the more humor-driven segment of the three segments featured in this episode, with the only real creepy parts being the lobotomy part.
Join us, Father.
It's bliss.
And Willie getting killed for the second time. But that's fine, The Simpsons is a comedy, and having a gag-driven segment is perfectly okay. This is probably the best middle cooldown segment in Treehouse of Horror history. It does the job of cooling the audience down perfectly. Also, fun fact, I didn't see Willie's death in this episode until the DVD release because this was constantly cut out of repeat airings. And another fun fact, James Earl Jones appears in his second Treehouse of Horror appearance ever.
This is indeed a disturbing universe.
But honestly, having not seen this scene, because I'd only watched this episode in repeat airings for years, kind of tripped me the fuck out, because I didn't even know it existed. I wasn't going on the internet, I wasn't watching, the original airings or tapings of the original airings. So when I saw this random scene of Maggie killing Willie, I was like, what the fuck? I kind of want to know what the universe is like. Come on, Simpsons writers, you're desperate and pathetic. You keep revisiting old shit because of dwindling public interest in the new episodes. Set a whole Halloween segment episode in the disturbing universe and get James Earl Jones to voice everybody. At the end of the day, Time and Punishment is a basic time travel story where the future keeps getting altered because of Homer's stupidity while traveling to the past, from squishing a bug to having a straight-up mental breakdown after not being able to get back to his own timeline.
Don't touch anything! I'll touch whatever I feel like!
I love a good time travel story, so despite its flaws and the fact that it is a cooldown segment, I still love this all the same as the other segment. And yes, I know it sounds like I'm contradicting myself because earlier I said this was the weakest segment and that I wouldn't give it a 10 if it was in any other Treehouse of Horror episode, but that doesn't change the fact that this is the funniest segment in this special and one of the funniest segments they've ever done. But this segment did have kind of an influence on me in the long run. I mentioned that I like time travel stories. I'm pretty sure this is the first time travel story outside of Star Trek that I ever watched. It's definitely the first one that I was able to process on a higher level. I literally learned what cause and effect was because of The Simpsons. At one point, I wanted to get a tattoo of that weird sloth thing that answers Homer's question about changing the future.
That was just one little insignificant mosquito. That can't change the future, right? Right?
And Time and Punishment contains one of the biggest Homer no moments in the series when he goes to his perfect universe only to find out that they don't know what donuts are.
Marge, dear, would you kindly pass me a donut?
Donut? What's a donut? It's raining again.
So he runs off in a panic, only for it to be revealed that it rains donuts in this universe. Even the writers on the commentary track have stated that they feel so bad for Homer because if he had just stayed a few more seconds, he would be in a paradise. But again, this is a Treehouse of Horror episode, so he ain't gonna get the happy ending. But since it's a cooldown segment, he gets the break-even ending.
What's gotten into you?
Nothing. Nothing at all. Let's just eat. Close enough.
Time and Punishment may be the weakest segment in this Treehouse of Horror episode, but that does not take away from the fact that it is probably the funniest one. If you're a sci-fi fan, you can really appreciate the whole cause and effect thing they do, and even if you're not a sci-fi fan, you can still enjoy Homer being a buffoon. There are just certain little bits in this segment that make me laugh for no apparent reason. Like when Homer goes to the one universe and Bart and Lisa are huge, what is with Lisa's voice? Why is it so fucked up and scratchy like that?
Hey, there's a bug that looks like Dad. Let's kill it. Okay.
When watching this segment, you can tell this is one that the writers and the voice actors just had a lot of fun doing, and as a result, you have a lot of fun watching it. It's definitely a breather segment, but that's not a bad thing. It also contains the obligatory Kang and Kodos appearance. Yeah, there was this weird thing in the kind of middle-ish Treehouse of Horror episodes, where the writers and the showrunners or whoever had to literally fight to get Kang and Kodos put into an episode because the producers were like, no, it takes too much time. You can tell for Treehouse of Horror 3, 4, and 5, before Kang and Kodos were really solidified as a staple of these specials, that they had to just cram them in however they could. But regardless, their appearance is always appreciated.
What happened? happened to us, Kodos?
Quiet, you.
The purpose of Time and Punishment being a complete cooldown segment was most likely to get us ready for what is quite possibly the most disturbing Simpsons Halloween segment ever. One that truly does play on childhood fears, and that is Nightmare Cafeteria. Kids hate school, and kids would hate school even more if there was the looming threat of the teachers eating them. It's a simple enough premise. They play on the lack of Springfield Elementary's budget, which is a common enough plot device for The Simpsons as a whole, but this time the teachers just end up resorting to cannibalism.
Jimbo, why don't you assist Lunch Lady Doris in the kitchen?
Bite me, Skinner.
Well, might we?
This whole segment is just so morbidly hilarious. Like, it's played for horror and for laughs, just as David Merkin intended. And the way that the teachers just immediately give into cannibalism without even questioning it is fucking ridiculous, but it's ridiculously funny.
You remember me telling Jimbo Jones that I'd make something of him one day?
Are you saying you killed Jimbo, processed his carcass, and served him for lunch?
I think as a kid, this one got me because one of the biggest fears a child could have is there being something horribly wrong and your parents don't believe you. It's a classic, almost primal fear within children. But you know what's worse than your parents not believing you? Your parents, like, believing you and not giving a shit.
Mom, you've gotta help. They're cooking kids in the school cafeteria.
Listen, kids, you're 8 and 10 years old now. I can't be fighting all your battles for you.
But Mom...
No buts. You march right back to that school, look them straight in the eye, and say, "Don't eat me."
Okay.
Like in any other episode, that's a very out-of-character reaction from Marge, but considering they're pressed for time and this is a Treehouse of Horror episode, they're like, let's just have Marge completely blow her kids off. And also, the final fun fact of this review is Homer actually does not appear in Nightmare Cafeteria. He had a scene, but it got cut before it was even animated or recorded. It's a scene that would have played into the joy of cooking Millhouse gag that happens later on. If I had to guess, they had to cut some stuff out for time, and they were like, well, Homer's the focus of the first 2 stories, we can leave him out of the 3rd one entirely. Despite this being a comedy and despite this being on network television, it's like, this is really the segment that pushed it. Like, the last 2 segments had some pretty fucked up shit, but Nightmare Cafeteria really teeters between horror and comedy. Like, it's funny, but it's like, this is like the darkest comedy I think that a Treehouse of Horror episode has ever produced. As an adult, I'm laughing at this, but like, I remember back to when I was a kid, I'm like, this actually creeped me out quite a bit.
After all, isn't there a little ooter in all of us? In fact, you might even say we just ate ooter and he's in our stomachs right now. Wait, scratch that one.
The segment itself starts out pretty slow. We don't really see anything. It's a lot of build-up. Like, we know what's happening, but it doesn't really go graphic for the first half of the segment. In fact, you know, despite the fact that this is probably the most disturbing segment in this special and possibly of the entire Treehouse of Horror series, it's really not all that graphic until the end. The real creepy part comes from when Bart, Lisa, and Milhouse escape from class and they're seeing, like, the conditions that the kids are being kept in, that they're, like, livestock. This didn't really bother me as much as a kid because, like, you really can't process it then, but, like, nah, growing up, I'm like, that's fucked up.
Easy there, young man. You'll only make yourself tired and stringy.
And then it just kind of jumps you with this horrifying image of Lunch Lady Doris. Like, I don't care what anybody says, like, this shit is still a little bit creepy even as an adult. And I am shocked that they got this past the censors back then because, like, my god, like, I had fucking nightmares about this episode when I was a kid. The way they drew and framed it, it's like, it looks horrifying, it looks jarring, but it's still The Simpsons. And I think that's a step that a lot of the Treehouse of Horror segments lost over the years. Like, the early Treehouse of Horror segments, like, they were definitely horror parodies and they were definitely, like, non-canon. But they had the ability to make these segments, for the most part, feel like it was an actual Simpsons episode. It felt like this could happen in that universe, but it's not happening in that universe. It goes without saying, when it comes down to them, like, cutting shit in syndication, Nightmare Cafeteria got cut down pretty hard. In some markets, when Lunch Lady Doris comes out, they actually edit the blood out of her apron. Like, this shit is just graphic. Like, when Milhouse goes face first into the grinder, the sound they use is just horrific.
Don't worry, guys. Something always comes along to save us. Nevertheless, I remain confident that something will come along and save the 2 Simpson children.
There's a part at the end when Bart and Lisa fall into the blender that's not only cut out of some repeat airings, but it's cut out on Disney Plus. As soon as Bart and Lisa hit the blender, like just for like a quick frame, the screen just has this red filter over it. A friend of mine actually pointed this out to me when the season came out on DVD. He was watching it and he was like, wait, that looked different, and he like slow-moed it. And now I can't unsee it like ever, and like when it's absent, it's very noticeably absent. And it almost bothers me because this is a good, quick visual horror gag that they did here. They were able to add a new element of horror years after I initially saw this episode. Now, the Shinning is bar none the greatest Treehouse of Horror segment of all time, but Nightmare Cafeteria, I think I would honestly go as far as to say that at this point in time, it is my favorite Simpsons Halloween segment, on a personal level. The top 10 I did is a bit out of date, feel free to watch it, it's probably one of the earlier videos I'm proud of, but I absolutely love how vile and ramped up Nightmare Cafeteria is, and it is now the #1 on that video. They set out to give kids nightmares with this shit, and I love them for it.
Hold on, kids! I'm coming to rescue the lot of you! Ow! Ugh, I'm bad at this.
But they actually managed to one-up it with the closing segment of the episode. So Bart wakes up from his nightmare, and likely this is supposed to be a parody of the previous seasons using wraparound segments, and we're led to believe that all of the stories took place in Bart's nightmare. And I guess, yeah, you know, what I meant when I said it's kind of parodying the wraparound segments is it feels like those wraparound segments from 1, 2, and 3, where it's like, yeah, they were telling the stories, but them telling the stories seemed like something that could be canon to the show. Besides, of course, Homer waking up with Mr. Burns' head on his shoulder. But, you know, you think it's gonna end, oh, it was just Bart's nightmares or whatever, and then the family gets attacked by that fog that turns people inside out.
Stupid cheap weather stripping!
And this whole thing is based on a radio drama that writer David X. Cohen remembers from childhood called Lights Out. And the way they drew this is so surreal and disturbing, and like over the years I've noticed more and more what they did with this animation, and it's made it way more effective as a horror element with time. And then they do a rather subtle callback to the earlier gag in The Shinning with the portable TV by singing a chorus line. But instead switching the lyrics around to be about the fog that turns you inside out. And yeah, this is definitely my favorite Simpsons song of all time. I know the lyrics by heart. I sing it sometimes to myself when I'm performing a monotonous task. It's just so catchy, like just one sniff of that fog and you're inside out.
It's worse than that flushy virus you've read.
I can sing the whole song, like, I'm gonna sing it once the mic goes off. And even Groundskeeper Willie gets to show up for the musical number with the family because he played a rather large part in the overall humor of the episode, being killed in all 3 segments. But hey, just because it's a funny musical number doesn't mean we can't have Bart get dragged off and mauled by his own dog. Treehouse of Horror 5 is the best for a reason. It provides a heap of humor but pushes the absolute limit of what they were allowed to show in terms of horror and violence, and because of that, it's not only been labeled the best Treehouse of Horror episode of all time, but many times it finds itself in the higher rankings for greatest Simpsons episode of all time. It is the 3rd highest rated Simpsons episode of all time on IMDb, and for a show that has well in excess of 700 episodes, this is an amazing feat. Treehouse of Horror 5 is not only a if I see it on, I sit my ass down and watch episode, but it's one that during Halloween, I'll watch it with all the other episodes, but then I'll probably go back and watch it again because it's that damn good. A 10 out of 10, no question about it. The imagery of this episode alone is just burned into my memory from early childhood. This is probably, along with the other Treehouse of Horror episodes, the first exposure that I had to the horror genre, and because of just how foul this episode got, it will always be held close to my heart as an all-time great episode of both the Treehouse of Horror series and The Simpsons as a whole. It is very deserving of the praise it gets. There's no aspects of it I could say are overrated or underrated. I have made my distaste for Season 6 pretty well known on this channel. Like, I don't hate the season, but I do think it is one of the weaker seasons in the peak years of the show. But I would go ahead and say Treehouse of Horror 5 almost picks up the slack for the entire season because it's just that damn good. Like, it's a top 5 episode of all time, which that's really weird because Season 6, with its ups and mostly downs, does not really bring a lot of, like, top episodes, but this one manages to be, like, in the top 5, top 3 even. That's just not my opinion. Like, general consensus consensus places this episode very high. This episode was so popular that even before they started releasing seasons on DVD, they were releasing Halloween compilation tapes where this episode was featured. And several kids that I grew up with had this fucking episode on tape. There is nothing they could have ever done to top Treehouse of Horror 5, and they never really tried, at least throughout the run that I was watching. And you know what? I kinda hope they never do try to top it, because even if they went all the fuck out, I don't think they could. And it would just be another embarrassment for modern Simpsons to try. You heard it here, probably not for the first time, because this isn't a unique opinion, but it is the correct opinion. Treehouse of Horror 5, which turns 30 this year, is still the best Treehouse of Horror episode ever made, and it probably will always be the best Treehouse of Horror episode ever made. It honestly should be in like the National Film Registry to be preserved for future generations. It's fucking awesome, it's the best one, and that's really all I have to say. It's hard to pick the most iconic moment of this episode because every big moment in this episode is just iconic. What are your thoughts on Treehouse of Horror 5? Probably the same as mine because it is the GOAT. Like, subscribe, and share me with your friends, and have a happy Halloween.
Oh no, they're gaining on me! Wait, I have an idea! These wieners will give me the quick energy I need to escape.